When you heard of the news of the collapsed interstate, what was your immediate sort of reaction with like how the PMTA could be involved?
Pushing 14,000 trucks, like you said, onto US 1 wasn't going to go well. So our focus was to try to get as much information to the through truckers as we could to show them alternatives so that they could avoid the entire region altogether because of the congestion that was going to result.
Hey everyone, and welcome to our podcast, Caution Wide Right. It's just another trucking podcast. Now, with me today is not just a local Girl Scout troop leader, which my daughter would be excited to hear. Of course, that's if a 9-year-old girl would like to listen to her dad talk about trucking regulations for an hour. But even better, with me is Rebecca Oyler, none other than the president and CEO of the Pennsylvania Motor Truck Association, which has been promoting the interests of the trucking industry since 1928. Imagine that, how long cars have been around. Trucking Association's been here the whole time. Rebecca comes from a policy writing background with nearly 20 years in state government, where she advanced policy and legislative initiatives involving economic development, elections, voter registration, and more. Before joining PMTA, she served as the Pennsylvania Legislative Director for the National Federation of Independent Businesses, which is a premier small business advocacy organization with about 13,000 members in Pennsylvania and 300,000 members nationwide, really getting her work cut out for the role for the PMTA and what she's doing today, advocating for businesses. She also taught as an adjunct faculty in Millersville University Department of Government and Political Affairs, a graduate of the Executive Leaders Program, and is a member of the Women in Pennsylvania Government Relations. Finally, last year, American Trucking Association presented its Trucking Association Executive Council Leadership Award. And you guessed it, Rebecca last year was named the recipient for her advocacy efforts on behalf of the industry. So Rebecca, welcome to the podcast.
I'm really happy to be here, Luke. Thanks for having me.
Now, incredible background. And before we begin, Toby, our cameraman, has a daughter. I myself have a little girl, and she's in Girl Scouts. I'm curious, like, what advice do you have for girls out there looking to become future leaders in our state or country?
Well, I think that's easy. I would say be bold, find your passion, and just remember that you were put on this earth at this time for a specific reason. Find your passion and go with it. Don't let anyone or anything hold you back. Do it.
And so as a Girl Scout troop leader, I'm just curious, what's your favorite pastime or activity involved with the girls?
Well, I always have to say that my favorite thing is being outdoors because I'm an outdoors person. I love hiking, camping, fishing, just splashing around in the creek. And those are the things I always try to get my girls out and do. But my girls really enjoyed, they still do enjoy community service a lot. So, of course, like all Girl Scout troops, we sell cookies every year.
Yep.
And every year, our girls voted on what they want to give their donation cookies for, and they really try to get donated cookies as much as they can. So this past year, I was really proud of them because I promised there was no influence involved from me, but they voted this past year to donate their cookies to truck drivers. So we had about 130 boxes of donated cookies, which we gave out at the state truck driving championships a couple weeks ago. So that was really exciting, and I have to think I've done something right in the troop to get them to focus on truck drivers. So very happy. So
your girls, they're involved in Girl Scouts. Were you originally involved in Girl Scouts as a kid too, a brownie, or what got you as a leader?
Yep, I was a Girl Scout all the way up until I was about 12 or 13. Yeah. And then I have to be honest, I got bored because I'll just tell you a funny story. We were sitting in the church basement making campfires with candlesticks one time, and I thought, this is silly. I can be out making real campfires. Mm-hmm. I want to do that. So I didn't last too long. I think our troop was not as active as I preferred to be, and I was on my own on the weekends anyway. So I quit when I was about 12 or 13. But then when I became a troop leader, I made it my mission to get my girls outside, in nature, learning how to make a real campfire and making those s'mores and out in nature hiking. And and all of that stuff. So that was really my big goal when I became a troop leader, is to make sure my girls did not get bored. And that happened because we had started with 9 girls a few years ago, and we still have 9 girls. So
yep, that's
really
awesome.
Happy about that. And they're seniors now. So
wow,
all 15.
So you've moved up with the age group as you went?
Yeah.
That's cool. That's cool. Yeah, I know my son's in Boy Scouts, and of course my daughter's in Girl Scouts, and there's moments where I'm like, well, I was involved in Boy Scouts as a kid, or my dad's military background. And so I'm like, they have dad's approval of doing a little bit more as well. So, teaching them how to properly handling a pocket knife or different things like that. It's definitely definitely interesting seeing the difference.
Yeah. Well, we've done pocket knives, we've done knots, we've done all the things that we can do. Try to teach those skills to the girls, because it's important. I think it's important for Girl Scouts to learn those things. Completely
agree. All right, so let's transition to some recent news that's actually been in the national headlines, I-95. So just 2 weeks ago, a tanker truck tipped over and caught fire under the exit ramp of I-95 in Philly, causing a massive fire, collapsed the roadway, of course, killing the driver. And this horrible news is not just tragic for the families involved, but the chaos that came from it from the trucking and logistics industries. Until the road is fixed, which was anticipated to take many months potentially, and ironically, the road's open in 12 days now. You mentioned in a Transport Topics article that an estimated 14,000 trucks cross that section of road daily, and the Port of Philadelphia is nearby. There's 7 million tons of cargo annually going in and out of there. When you heard of the news of the collapsed interstate, what was your immediate sort of reaction with how the PMTA could be involved?
Well, it's funny. I mentioned the truck driving championships. We had our truck driving championships dinner the night before this happened. So we had about 930 people in a room, and, highlight of the year, truck driving, and our drivers were just, the focus that weekend. And we woke up Sunday morning to that, and it was just tragic and just awful. And that said, like you said, 12 days later, the interstate was open. But from PMTA standpoint, our first thought, and the first thought I had when I found out the news, is just get the information out. Right. Because as we all know, the trucking industry, is resilient. And if you give them the information that they need to make good decisions, they can make decisions. So our first thought was to get as much information as we could out to our members and to the public at large and the industry. So we quick sent an email out. We started posting information on our website, and we just put as much information as possible out so that the industry and truckers going through and into the area would have as much information as possible. So of course we shared PennDOT's official detour information. We shared the PA 511 website as well as PennDOT's information, and just tried to share as much information as possible right away.
I know the news was also changing rapidly. Of course, I was following it on social media, and you got the people that like to overblow situations of what is it hauling? How did the bridge actually collapse? It couldn't just be a normal fire. All this drama that went around it, which is always crazy, because then you're you can't correct everybody from something like that.
And you just want to deal with the situation. Look, we have a real situation here. Let's focus on managing it. So that's what we had to do.
You mentioned, of course, that the official detour was US 1, and that could greatly impact traffic and congestion, obviously. But what's less known is that is a big concern for safety for our drivers, because disrupting routes, congestion, it leads to crashes. Pushing commercial vehicles to roads not designed to trucks creates its own problems. When PMTA asked the state to consider some of these issues, what or how are these decisions made, and how quickly can things change with your advice?
Well, it's interesting. We were talking to PennDOT right away Sunday morning, and we were putting out the official detour information. But our initial thought, too, was that we're talking about sort of 2 categories of truck here. We're talking about the through truckers that are literally just going, through the area on 95. We need to get them out of the area, because that detour on US 1, pushing 14,000 trucks, like you said, onto US 1 wasn't going to go well. So our focus was to try to get as much information to the through truckers as we could to show them alternatives so that they could avoid the entire region altogether because of the congestion that was going to result. So the bigger problem actually was the trucks who were delivering and picking up those local businesses right in that region.
Right.
And a lot of them were located right near the bridge and right along Route 1 there, which, like, as you said, is not designed for trucks. Yep. So we knew we were going to see a lot of problems, and we did hear some businesses that weren't getting deliveries. We know there were some members that just had to stop delivering or picking up in those areas just because of the congestion in the area. So we knew that was the biggest concern, and we did talk to PennDOT about that. And I think their response was to just, again, put out as much information as possible. So they did revamp their local detours a little bit.
Right.
They adjusted their signage, and I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is now we have, we all have GPS, systems. We can all go online and look at the traffic. They even, I had so much fun sitting in my office, well, if you can call it fun, in Harrisburg, and right across the river from Harrisburg, looking at cameras on the roads in Philadelphia, which, you could see, what the congestion was like on the Schuylkill Expressway, for example, which was part of the detour. And you could see how traffic was adapting to the closure. And that was really interesting. And I do think PennDOT adapted itself to some of those natural detours that some of these companies and some of the drivers were taking. So it was interesting to watch. From our perspective at PMTA, we were trying to make folks aware of the impact on those local trucks that were trying to get in and out of those businesses, because that region of Philadelphia was high manufacturing,
right.
Food suppliers, small businesses that needed to get pickups and deliveries there. So not to mention the port, like you said.
Well, yeah, you mentioned the food suppliers. I mean, the port too, like I think you mentioned in the article that over 54% of the stuff going through the port is refrigerated goods. It's produce, which
lots of reefer trucks.
Right. And they might be going up through to New York or wherever. And I know during our time during this, we're like, hey, you might want to consider going through the New Jersey Turnpike. Turnpikes are no fun for everybody, extra costs. But you mentioned that you had to work with the New Jersey Motor Truck Association as well. How's that partnership look? What was those discussions like? It's
kind of interesting to think that this specific section of Interstate 95, there are a lot of routes around it, luckily.
Right.
So a lot of the through traffic already was taking 295 over to the Jersey Turnpike. So we talked about that, and we're aware that that was the way a lot of traffic was going to divert. So it was kind of keeping an eye on that and what the impacts would be. And so it was more along those lines because we were aware that that was a route that a lot of the through trucks were already taking. So it was just going to increase the congestion likely on those routes. Now, talking to our members, a lot of them also routed around the region by going to Pennsylvania Turnpike. So we know that was also the case. And even farther out to the west, 83, 81, 78. And it's like I said, truckers are resilient. They're going to find a way. Just give them all the information they need. Now, one thing that was interesting is I drove around a lot. I didn't go to Philadelphia. I haven't been there yet, but drove around some of the other interstates, and I noticed a lot more truck traffic, at the rest areas and things like that. So I do think that there was a lot of diversion of the through trucks onto the surrounding interstates, which isn't a bad thing. And it was a temporary situation, and I think everyone made the best of it. So
I mean, yeah, for it taking less than 2 weeks for at least continued traffic, I think it's one lane right now getting through, but still it's better than nothing. And
it's 3 lanes.
Oh, 3 lanes.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. That's incredible.
Yeah.
And I know, of course, because when this stuff kind of happens, it's like, okay, well, what about truck parking? Because Philly is a big area. And then if it's going to be less diverted through Philly, whose truck parking is an issue anyway.
Well, and that's one of the things we were trying to communicate during this period is, look, if trucks are getting off the highway and they're getting into some of these back streets in Philadelphia, which they were, some very small back streets in Philadelphia, sometimes they're going to need to pull over and stop. So be patient, be understanding
Right.
that this is a situation that we have to deal with. It's not the trucker's fault. It's nobody's fault. It's just something we're just gonna have to deal with for a little bit. So we were trying to get the word out about that as well.
And I thought it was interesting. You mentioned the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and I know during the time, I mean, obviously it's more tolls, more cost associated with, for these trucking companies to have to deal with. In fact, I think, I forget who, a recent article, Landline or somebody said that the cost of operation for a trucking company was the highest it's ever been, $2 a mile. And PMTA was looking into a toll fee waiver in those coming days and weeks. With it open, did that go anywhere? Is it still being something pursued?
No, that, like we said, the interstate was opened so quickly at 60% capacity that it wasn't something that we actually had time to move, because in this case, because the Turnpike Authority to toll is actually a legislative authority. It comes from the General Assembly. So we would have had to get a bill passed in the state legislature, and that takes a little bit of time. So that we didn't end up having to go that route in this case, but we did start asking the questions as to whether that would be possible.
And then obviously they're still working on the bridge. It's going to take obviously months, but I mean, that's part of the process. Get the roads open and then finish it up at a decent pace. And I think yesterday, the House passed a resolution to try to keep funding for, this construction and this effort being funded. Is PMTA a part of continued process with this, or what's the future for PMTA and the I-95 stuff?
Well, we're just going to continue to be supportive of getting the interstate back up to 100% capacity and getting it fixed. There was a disaster declaration that was required in order to get the funding, the federal funding to get it fixed, and we obviously supported that, and we're continuing to be supportive of getting the interstate back to 100%.
Very cool. So we can see a little bit about how PMTA helps the trucking industry in the state. When I was a part of the Oregon Trucking Association before moving out here, I often came across drivers, owner-operators, even small and larger fleets sort of not understanding what these trucking associations do for them. And obviously they're not spending the time emailing legislation or complaining about certain things. They're not going on Capitol to comment on bills and stuff being passed and so much more. What does it mean to be a member of the PMTA, and how does the organization help trucking companies?
Sure. Well, we have about a little over 1,200 members right now in Pennsylvania. And those are trucking companies, small and large, all the way from, single owner operators all the way up to the biggest companies in the nation. And we also have a lot, I think at PMTA, we actually have a lot of small businesses. So think of your businesses that drive trucks but aren't necessarily thought of as trucking companies. Yep. And we have a lot of those in our membership as well. But then, of course, we also have the companies that support trucking. Even if they aren't trucking companies proper, they sell products, services, like CNS, to our members and to trucking companies in the state. So those are also members of ours. And what we do is sort of a three-pronged approach. We have our legislation and regulatory area where we promote policies that are going to lead to success in the trucking industry here in Pennsylvania, and we'll probably get into some of those here during our discussion. So regulations and legislation. And like you said, your typical trucking company owner doesn't have time to go, sit up on the hill and listen to hearings all day. So we kind of keep monitoring that and let everybody know what things are happening up on Capitol Hill. So that's the first part. The second part is networking. We actually try to promote networking amongst our companies so that you can stay up to date in the latest news and information in the industry and the latest products and all those types of things. So networking is a big part of what we do. And lastly, but not least, certainly, is safety. We promote safety and in two ways, actually. We're happy to take safety questions, promote safety products, and we have a safety day where it's a big focus of what we do every year, and answer safety questions. Safety is a big part of what we do. We have a safety management council that meets on safety issues continuously. But the last thing, or the second part of the safety aspect, is we actually try to teach the public how to drive safely around big trucks too, which I think is a very important thing that's kind of lacking right now in education. So we have a road team, and we try to promote public information that talks about no zones and following distance and all those things that help drivers out on the road understand how to drive safely around big trucks. So
and that's why we titled the podcast "Caution Wide Right." It's that same sign, same imagery, and I think that's fascinating because obviously, what's the statistic that 70% of crashes involving a commercial motor vehicle is not caused by the truck; it's caused by the everyday driver. Yeah. So
right. So we do what we can to try to head that off.
Yeah, and I know, it's always, I think owners, trucking companies, no matter what size, you got to go check out and go on to your state capitol and actually be involved with your organization to talk with legislation and legislators, get in part of that process, because just seeing it and seeing how these things work is just fascinating to me. And it's relationships, right? Because you talk in the ear of legislators and you're building these relationships. Tell me a little bit about that. How do you build that?
Yeah, relationships are critical. I have to tell you, it's probably the most important part of the legislative aspect of what we do. And you mentioned sort of going up and meeting legislators. That's really important. But on the flip side, it's really important too to get the legislators out to you.
Yes.
So one of the things we've tried to do is get some of these state senators, state representatives, and also congressmen to come visit a trucking company, sit down and talk to the owner, listen to some of the concerns and the challenges that they have, because everyone knows there's lots of them in the industry. There's plenty to talk about. So that has been very successful. We started having legislative events a couple of years ago where we'll do just that. We'll find a member who's willing to host an event, and we'll invite all the local lawmakers to come sit down and talk to PMTA members and try to get the room full and just have a conversation. And that has gone so well. I've been so pleased because we built a lot of really good relationships that way. One event that we had out in Western Pennsylvania a few years ago, I actually was up on the Hill at a hearing or something talking to a state representative who was at that particular hearing. And he said, "Oh, hey, I'm so glad I got to come to that meeting. I called, the gentleman that I met there, and he was telling me all about this issue that I had a concern with, and he actually came on site and we talked." And so that's the kind of relationship that we really need. And we need, it's a complicated industry, trucking. And the lawmakers that we're trying to advocate and educate about the industry, most of them don't know the first thing about it. So it really is an education, and look at it as you're trying to educate a decision maker, a policy maker that's making policies in Harrisburg or in Washington for your industry. And if they don't know the first thing about your industry, how are they going to make good decisions?
Exactly.
So it's a matter of educating them and then being available to answer questions.
Yes.
So we're just trying to make links between our membership and be a resource where we can provide information for the policymakers from our membership,
right?
So that we get good policy out of Harrisburg and Washington.
And I'm curious too, because you took over the role during really the midst of the pandemic. What was it like? Obviously, you probably couldn't go in person to build these relationships, or whether it's the mask mandates or whatever, or even, maybe there was a sympathetic ear for the trucking industry because they realized how needed it was getting stuff into grocery stores and things like that. What was the pandemic like with that?
Yeah, so I started in February of 2021. So we were just coming out of the pandemic. Right. We did have our membership conference virtually that year, which was tough. I think we all found that really tough because we work in an industry that generally does not work remotely.
Right.
So all of us sort of struggle with that. But we really tried to have in-person events as soon as we possibly could. So we did have legislative events in person that year. We did, I traveled out. As soon as I started going out and meeting companies and meeting owners and learning about the industry and talking with folks about it. So I just really tried to dive in, and we tried to get up and running as quickly as we could after the pandemic. But to your point, I think that the pandemic, if there was anything good to come out of it, really did shine a light on truck drivers, supply chains. I mean, you can't talk to anybody anymore who doesn't have an opinion about supply chains or understand supply chains and appreciate truck drivers. And I hope that doesn't go away anytime soon. I really do.
Feels like it, but it's something that we got to continue to press, continue to educate. And that's the whole point. That's the whole point of this.
Yeah, yeah.
So according to the ATA president, Chris Spear, in the last couple of years, you've excelled in revamping the association, scoring multiple legislative victories in the process. And he specifically pointed out the bridge tolls. So Pennsylvania DOT, PennDOT had been pursuing, I think it was like nine different highway bridges for more tolls, especially for truckers. And you spearheaded an effort it involved building an opposition coalition, engaging the public and the media to bring attention to it, and then working closely to mount a legal challenge throughout this. And then the court sided with the PMTA-led coalition that ruled PennDOT failed to follow proper procedure pursuing the bridge tolling initiative. I'm just curious, tell me a little bit about that.
Sure. Actually, it was funny. It was right around the time I started at PMTA. I think the second day I was there, I did an interview on TV about that specific issue. So it kind of got baptized by bridge tolling. Baptized by bridge tolling.
I love that.
But yeah, it was a huge issue, one that would have affected all of our members.
Yeah.
PennDOT was planning to toll 9 interstate bridges across the state, in every corner of the state, 4 on Interstate 80. So if you were traveling from one side of the state to the other, you'd actually across 4 tolled bridges.
Yep.
And we did the calculation, and for cars, they were talking about $1 to $2, but for trucks, $10 to $12 per crossing. So we did the calculation. It would have been $5,000 to $6,000 per truck per year, which, some people thought that wasn't a lot. But if you take that times the number of trucks and the number of crossings that a lot of our members and a lot of, companies in Pennsylvania cross those bridges quite a lot, especially the ones located near the bridges, obviously, are going to be impacted the most. It would have had a huge impact on the industry in Pennsylvania. We're talking, over time, billions of dollars of costs layered on top of an already expensive industry here in Pennsylvania. We are already the 3rd most expensive state to drive a truck in.
Right.
So it would have been just devastating. But I think the most galling thing about that proposal was that it was a COVID, project. They didn't do any public notification about it. It was a virtual meeting of the Public-Private Partnership Board at PennDOT, where they announced this proposal and voted on it with, I think there were 4 slides that the board was shown.
Oh my gosh.
So we wouldn't have even known about it except our lobbyist in Harrisburg alerted us, hey, I just heard something. Maybe you should tune into this P3 board hearing, which of course was virtual. So tuned in, and big surprise, there was a bridge tolling vote. So it was just really galling how that happened because, we all try to trust our government, and there are certain processes that you need to go through in order to be responsive to the citizens of the state. And voting on a public-private partnership board, voting on a virtual meeting in the middle of a pandemic to impose tolls on everybody in Pennsylvania, which we believe is a tax, is just not the way things should be done. So we fought it from the very beginning, from that very first P3 board meeting all the way through the end. And like you said, we fought it a couple different ways, educating people about it, educating them about the costs involved and about how, processes weren't followed. They didn't announce it ahead of time. There was no public comment period before it was voted on. There was just no process followed. We fought it legislatively. We started talking to lawmakers and using those relationships that you talked about, calling up friends in Harrisburg and saying, were you aware this was happening? Do
Right.
your constituents know this is happening? And a lot of our members did that. They called their state senators, they called their state representatives, and were really pushing back because they used those relationships they already had. And then the legal challenge, like
Right.
you said, there were some municipalities outside of Pittsburgh that filed a lawsuit challenging the process because this was just a faulty process. And we submitted an amicus friend of the court brief on that lawsuit. There was another lawsuit filed in central Pennsylvania too, but the court tossed out, it was two parts, two separate cases, but ultimately the case that we filed our amicus brief on tossed the P3 proposal out, stopped the 9-bridge tolling, and then a few months later, the General Assembly passed a law that prohibited it. So it was really, I called it a 3 strikes and you're out, because there were 2 lawsuits with a decision in our favor, and then the law finally passed, which was sponsored by Senator Langerholtz, and actually outlawed what they did through that process.
And so are we hearing any other news that maybe they're trying other efforts for more tolls in other ways?
Well, like I said, that law that passed, Senator Langerholtz's bill, would prohibit that from happening in the future. If they try to do a P3 with tolls in the future, there's a lot of requirements that would have to happen. It would have to be approved through the General Assembly. There would have to be a public comment period. It would have to be transparent. It would have to be published so we would all know about it ahead of time.
The way it should be.
Exactly. And then it can only be on optional options and new infrastructure.
Okay.
So if they were building another lane onto an interstate and wanted to charge a toll for that specific lane, they'd be allowed to do that, but not for currently existing free interstate roads. So there's a lot of hoops you would have to jump through to do that in the future. And that's, if I can add that too, that's important because we know New York is dealing with congestion tolling right now. I think by defeating this bridge tolling effort in Pennsylvania last year, we were able to head off because PennDOT had things like congestion tolling and full interstate tolling in mind after they finished the bridge tolling.
Right.
So that's not going to happen now, at least not through a P3 process. It would have to take an act of the General Assembly. So I don't think we'll be looking at things like congestion tolling that anytime soon that New York is dealing with.
And I'm curious, because relationships with other maybe trucking associations in other states, are they reaching out to you discussing are there other examples in their states that they can sort of follow something similar or push for?
Well, generally, we all do work together as much as we can. So whether there's a lawsuit or a specific, legislative victory that a state has, we like to share it with each other so that we can, take good examples and follow the lead elsewhere. And one place that's happening right now is lawsuit abuse reform. We're trying to across the country, we're trying to make a big push for lawsuit abuse reform. So here in Pennsylvania, we're trying to get a bill introduced right now to allow seatbelt use to be introduced into court. There's a seatbelt gag rule in Pennsylvania, and it's hard for a lot of people to believe, but even though you're required by law to wear a seatbelt in Pennsylvania, that can't be introduced into court. Right now. So we're trying to get that changed. That's a difficult change. Anytime you talk about, changing processes that lead to lawsuit abuse, it's a steep hill to climb, but we're working on that. But I know a lot of states have been very successful, and we're trying to rack up the victories there.
I like it. And so the most recent news surrounding PMTA is that in the last week or two, PMTA and the 4 members are suing the Department of Environmental Protection, the DEP, over CARB regulations. And this is where I got to transition to here because there's so much detail to discuss about CARB. So we need to do a quick little history lesson. CARB is the California Air Resource Board. You've probably heard about it with the heavy push in California for electrification, strong emission standards for engines in the state, and then other states are potentially adopting these things. And so where did California get this ability? And So specifically, California has the unique power to design its own vehicle emission standards because in 1970, the Federal Clean Air Act gave California the authority to deal with the smog around Los Angeles. So other states cannot adopt their own emission standards as far as I can tell. Instead, they have two options: either adopt the strict California emission standards or use the federal standards, which are less strict. Now, today there are 16 other states that have adopted or partially adopted or are looking to adopt into California's strict emission standards. Specifically in Pennsylvania, it was 20 years ago that Pennsylvania DEP adopted CARB's emission standards, specifically referencing for the diesel-powered vehicles weighing over 14,000 pounds. And so as a result, anytime CARB revises its rules, Pennsylvania's heavy-duty diesel emissions control program has to automatically update to adopt the California rules. There's still a process in place. And while this is interesting, the crazy part about all of this is that there's more strict regulations that CARB adopts over time. Specifically, August 2022, CARB adopted California Governor Gavin Newsom's zero emissions program by 2035. So it relied on heavy vehicle technologies such as plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, battery electric, and hydrogen fuel cells electric to meet the air quality and climate emission standards for the state. Of course, that has a knock-on effect for other states adopting it relatively automatically. These regulations include increasing stringent standards for gasoline cars, heavy passenger trucks to continue to reduce the smog emissions. And the advanced clean truck regulation would require that by 2045, every truck in Pennsylvania be zero emission. That's just over 20 years. And the California rule is estimated to have like 300,000 zero emission trucks on the roads by 2035. And that's a lot in just like a 10-year time frame. Even though Pennsylvania was one of the 15 states to sign on to CARB's advanced clean truck regulation in 2020, there'd still be, DEP would still be required to promulgate new regulations through a public process. Rebecca, I'm curious, how do these regulations have a catastrophic impact on the transportation industry?
Well, that's a lot to talk about. Emissions regulations are very complicated, but initially, how my attention came to it is 2 years ago during the summer, right before 2020, so it would be the summer of 2021, we had some dealer members of ours come to us and say, hey, trucks are really increasing in cost next year. This is a real problem for us. And come to find out, the problem was that because we were tied into these CARB, California emission standards from 20 plus years ago, and they were changing in 2022 to, in the 2022 regulations only required an additional warranty be purchased on the truck. So that didn't change the engine. It was the same engine, same truck, period, that was sold elsewhere. But the cost was going up between $2,300 and $4,500 per truck just because of the warranty, the mandatory warranty. So I started asking a lot of questions. Well, how did this happen? How do we get here? And so that's how we figured out that we had, signed on to this emissions standard 20 years ago. And it was going to be affecting us starting in 2022, but stepping up, like you said, so that more and more onerous emissions requirements are going into effect over the next couple of years, including in 2024. And then again in 2027, in which those 2 years we have extremely strict CARB emissions standards going into effect. So up until recently, those CARB standards hadn't been a huge problem because there really wasn't any difference between those standards and the EPA standards. But it's going to be a huge problem from here on out because it will be difficult to purchase trucks across the country that comply with the California standards because it's difficult to produce them. 2024, not so much, but in 2027, it's going to be difficult for the manufacturers to figure out the best solution to comply with the standards. And then once they figure it out, just getting enough trucks out to meet demand is a whole nother issue. So there's a huge possibility that there won't be trucks available in certain classes that comply with California standards. So in order to protect Pennsylvania's trucking industry, which of course is a huge industry and responsible for a lot of jobs and economic growth in the state, we thought it best just to try to get a handle on this and see if we could get out from underneath the California standards. Because fundamentally, we just don't think it's fair that California regulators regulate Pennsylvania trucks.
And I'm curious because obviously, it was adopted 20 years ago for Pennsylvania to do that. Has there been past examples where, DEP was sued over CARB regulations in the past?
Not that I know of.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any. It hasn't been an issue until recently, I believe. So
yeah, and I know. You got the manufacturers are suing CARB specifically in California over this, and I can't remember if that actually they just settled or something with this process. But then there's also, of course, 2 other states of the 16 states that are involved with adopting CARB. You got Minnesota and you got Virginia fighting it in their own way as well. Minnesota is fighting it. They're suing as well, and they're claiming specifically that the requirements violate EPCA. That's their Energy Policy and Conservation Act, which creates, actually it's the federal government's EPCA. So it creates a uniform national standard for vehicle fuel efficiency, prohibits states from adopting other standards that contradict federal fuel economy standards. And so they're suing CARB basically what seems like out of existence. I don't know if you're aware of this legal battle.
Well, I know there are, I think, 15 other states' attorneys general who are actually suing the federal government for turning over national regulations to CARB.
Right.
Essentially,
oh, wow.
That should be illegal. Because it's like you said, states have 2 choices. They can either choose to go along with the CARB standards or stick to the EPA federal standards. But I'm not an attorney, but I don't know of any other law where you can choose to follow another state or go with the federal right. It's so awkward, It's so strange. And why a state would turn over its own legislative and regulatory authority to another state just doesn't make much sense to me. So I think there's a really valid challenge to that law. So I hope it succeeds.
And if it does succeed, does that mean the state would have their own standards that they could do, or is it just defaulting back to federal regulations?
Well, like I said, not attorney, but I think it would default to the federal.
I believe so too. That's what it sounds like. Because then again, that whole chaos of trying to mandate each state having their own power for this would be an interesting process moving forward, and a different tackle, which sounds like nobody wants anyway.
That's not to say too, I think the federal regulations are concerning as well.
Yes.
The federal EPA, heavy duty emissions regulations also are very concerning. And I know the industry is trying to fight for more realistic, doable emission standards there as well.
Right. And I know, so Virginia, when they're fighting it, I think it's legislative. They have a House bill that's trying to get through, that did get through, to get out of under CARB's regulations, but likely going to be shot down in their Senate. I believe Pennsylvania as well. It passed the House for fighting it legislatively to get out under CARB, and again, likely going to be shot down in the Senate. Legislatively, are you a part of that legislative process as well?
Yes, that was the first thing we tried. We had a bill introduced in the House. Our members testified in a hearing, and the legislators agreed that it was a valid concern and wanted us to try to get out from under CARB. So, and I will say, even the Department of Environmental Protection in Pennsylvania understands that this was a concern for the industry. Right. They realized that in 2022, the only difference was the warranty. It was the same engine. So they actually issued a suspension of enforcement order. So they aren't actually enforcing the regulation right now in Pennsylvania. But one of the problems with that suspension order is that it actually leaves companies, both dealers and buyers of trucks, liable for a challenge. So if a private entity wanted to challenge them in court for not following the regulation, that could be done. So that's a concern for us. So we did ask for a legal change, and there was a bill introduced in the House that year. It did pass the House, and it got over to the Senate, but it got all the way to the very end of the process. It just wasn't considered at the end of the session in the Senate. So this year we actually have a bill that moved in the Senate, and it would suspend enforcement of CARB through and address the liability concern too, through model year 2020 until model year 2027. So at least it's a delay. And that has passed the Senate, and now it's in the House. It hasn't yet been considered in the House.
And so just remind me, the viewers, so the legislative process in the state, each state has the process, create new bills, they have a timeline to try to get it passed, and then the end of the session happens. When's the start of that process?
So each session in Pennsylvania is 2 years. And we just had a session start this year, to the 2023-24 legislative session. So all bills that are introduced, that were introduced last session, have to be reintroduced this session. So we got that particular bill reintroduced this session, and it has to pass either the House or the Senate, whichever House it's introduced in, and then it has to go over to the other chamber and be passed there, and then be signed by the governor. And of course, there's committees that it has to go through as a part of that process too. Usually, the transportation committees, in our case. So that's where we are. That bill has passed in the Senate committee, made it all the way through, passed finally in the House on the Senate floor, and then got over to the House chamber, and now is in the House Transportation Committee. It hasn't been considered yet there.
Right. And so obviously all of this is surrounding, obviously zero emissions, electrification that's coming, diesel trucks. Do you see that still being the future? Is it a long-term thing? Obviously you want to slow it down to just be able to handle a transition, but is this inevitable?
Is the transition to electric inevitable?
Electrical or zero emissions, whatever that's defined as?
Well, I think we don't know that yet.
Yeah.
I think the trucking industry is going to be diesel for a long time yet.
Especially long haul.
Yes, exactly. But that said, I do think there are certain sectors of the industry that it makes sense to be looking at other options, and they are looking at other options. So some of those options are electric, but I don't want to discount things like CNG, LNG, and hydrogen is coming too.
Yes.
So part of the issue that I have with mandates, like CARB's mandates, that are pushing us sort of ahead of the technology, I have a real issue with that because we want to let the technology develop, because we may be making decisions now that, set us up for failure in the future. Because who's to say that we're not going to develop the perfect solution for instance, long-haul trucks and hydrogen? Right. But if we're going to mandate no emissions electric vehicles now, we're not going to allow the time for us to develop that technology that over the longer term is going to be much better for the environment and for the industry. Yep. So I think we have to be give a little grace to the time period that it takes to develop these technologies, and be realistic about what the industry needs out of the technology. Because if we go too fast, we're going to be making probably poor choices for the environment, and B, for the industry. And everybody knows how important the trucking industry is. We do not want to set it up for failure.
And that makes complete sense. And then we're also in this environment where President Biden passed the infrastructure bills, which has a big influx of money into this EV transition process. In the state of Pennsylvania, there's a lot of discussion of, charging stations. Obviously, there's regulations on, what kind of vehicles, smaller vehicles, what the charging standards are. But for medium and heavy duty trucks, there's no standard yet for charging stations specifically. But while there's this long-term or even this quick discussion on infrastructure, electric charging infrastructure in Pennsylvania, is PMTA still in this process of sort of, hey, make sure that there's drive-through charging stations for truckers eventually, keep that plan in place, or?
Well, I think we have to be aware of that. I've had a lot of conversations with PennDOT lately on truck parking, because I am actually the chair of study that they're doing right now in truck parking. And I try to bring this up from time to time when we talk about freight planning, truck parking, that type of stuff. And luckily, we're not pushing the industry into electric right now in Pennsylvania. However, surrounding states are.
Right.
So those trucks in surrounding states are going to need to drive through Pennsylvania and stop at Pennsylvania rest areas.
Yep.
So that's one of the things that I do bring up when I get the chance, that we need to give some thought to the charging infrastructure for sure. And we know that charging trucks is just worlds different than charging cars.
Completely.
And I just saw, I'm sure you saw it too, ATRI study on electric charging infrastructure, that just one truck stop that they used as a pilot would be the equivalent of 15,000 homes. So a lot of these truck stops and a lot of rest areas that we're talking about are in rural areas where there's not a lot of infrastructure, period, not to mention like
Correct.
truck parking or even roads. There's just not a lot of infrastructure, period. So we do not have the electric infrastructure to build out those charging stations right now. So it's absolutely something that needs to be thought of and something that I try to bring up. But when we talk about truck parking, we know there's not enough parking spaces for trucks as it is. 1 for every 11 drivers is nowhere near enough. And we know of a major problem in Pennsylvania. So if you're talking about building charging infrastructure and you're talking about going electric, you're going to have charging stations for all those truck parking spaces too.
Exactly. Right.
So we don't have enough
Right.
truck parking. So we're talking billions and billions of dollars. So I just say that we need to be realistic about how we're approaching this.
Well, and it makes sense because obviously, Tesla semis coming, and in California, I think Pepsi's the one that has them, Frito-Lay.
Yeah.
And they were like, okay, well, we'll build a charging station on site for Frito-Lay. That includes a solar powered charging plant, so they have infrastructure for that, and that costs hundreds of thousands of dollars, 50,000 or 100,000. I forget what the number is, but it doesn't matter because the idea is whether it's truck parking, whether it's these gas stations that are looking to expand, it's not just charging infrastructure, it's solar, it's where you're going to get the energy for it. Like I know, was it Ohio, Pennsylvania, on the turnpike, they're looking to do electric charging under the roadway. So charging while you drive. And their goal was, it's fascinating technology if it especially gets to the point where it makes sense, let alone trucking's a lot more energy needed. So would it even work for trucking? Who knows? But if that happens, again, that's using, their plan is to build a solar field to charge or be able to handle that charging. And you got to think, you just mentioned infrastructure in general. We don't have space for not just the charging, but then the solar or however else they're going to get the electricity. It's an interesting dilemma.
Well, and not only that, but I talk about the lack of truck parking now. Generally, we're hearing from members that if you're going to replace trucks with electric trucks, it's a 1 to 2 proposition. So you really have to buy 2 electric trucks to replace that 1 diesel truck. And that has to do with a lot of things, charging time, your drivers, using your driver's time effectively. And, a lot of the components that go into driving an electric truck. Well, imagine twice the trucks on the road too, and what that means for infrastructure. So there's just really a lot to think about. And we just have to be very careful with mandates.
Yeah, and I know I follow the California stuff with Tesla too, because they're anticipating trying to get to 50,000 new trucks every year produced. I think by 2025, end of 2024, 2025 really is their goal, which is incredible to think that there's only 200, 300,000 trucks produced annually, that would be a huge chunk of that. But then at the same time, Elon's specifically saying the electric infrastructure grid needs to grow 3x by like 10 or 20 years to handle all of this transition. And so it's just, there's so much potentially changing and happening, and it's quick, and it's like, again, taking that step back, I can see why that's definitely needed. I'm just curious, are there other things carriers can do now, whether they're a member of PMTA or not a member of PMTA, that they can be involved in these processes?
Sure. Well, we have a lot of information on our website, and we do post information about all the things that we're involved with there. We have an emissions specific website there. We have truck parking information. Obviously, any news that comes out of Harrisburg, we'll post that as well. We didn't talk a lot of detail about the CARB lawsuit that we filed, but we do have the link there from information about that. So you always can check out our website. Give us a call if you have any questions. We're happy to help.
And are there other things that PMTA is looking forward to moving forward? And we touched, I think there were like 3 or 4 things they were talking about moving forward. Are there anything else that we've missed that PMTA is looking at?
This is budget season in Harrisburg. So statutorily, they are supposed to have a budget passed by the end of June. So it's a crazy time in the Capitol right now where they all try to get, all the bills passed that they want to get before they take a break for the summer. So there's a couple of things that we're watching right now in Harrisburg. And one is, and both sort of fall into the category of transportation funding generally, because as we've said, Pennsylvania is the 3rd most expensive state in the country. We're one of them. We have the highest diesel tax in the country here in Pennsylvania, if you count sales tax on top. And we have very high registration fees for trucks here in Pennsylvania too. So we're doing what we can to make the state more business friendly for trucks. Because it's just such an important industry for the entire economic, condition of the state, just generally. Right. So infrastructure spending is very important to us because we pay generally almost 40% of the taxes for infrastructure here in Pennsylvania. Trucks do. So we want to make sure our infrastructure funds are spent efficiently and that there's sufficient funding to fund infrastructure. And one of the bills we're supporting right now would put a fee on electric vehicles, because we were talking about that. Electric cars specifically. We have a tax that is supposed to be remitted on electric use monthly in Pennsylvania, and it's not widely followed. People aren't aware of it. It's not promoted. It's difficult. I mean, you have to send a check to the Department of Revenue. No one really likes to do that. So this would just put a fee annually as part of your registration on top of a vehicle fee for an electric car. So that would put some more funding into the motor license fund in here, Pennsylvania, that can be used for infrastructure, for roads and bridges. And we think that's fair because otherwise electric vehicles obviously don't pay gas tax. And then the other thing that we're supporting is to start to move state police funding out of the motor license fund. We're all in favor of supporting our partners in law enforcement. Obviously don't want them to be underfunded. We want them to be supported as much as possible. But those funds are specifically meant for roads and bridges and infrastructure development. So we're supportive of a bill that would shift that state police funding from the motor license fund to shift it to come from other areas. Right. So that would put more funding back into the motor license fund to make sure that we're taking care of our infrastructure properly. Good. So that's sort of another thing we do is keep an eye on how our infrastructure funds are spent and make sure that our roads and bridges are going to be well taken care of in the future. So.
That's great. Thank you so much for joining me today, Rebecca. There's a lot that we covered, a lot of ways people can get involved. So reach out to us in the comments below. Is there anything that you want to know more about? Is there something you were a part of that you want to talk about? But of course, follow Rebecca, the PMTA on social media. I know they're on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and of course, their website as well. Stay up to date. We'll do our best to pass along the information as well from the PMTA. And with that, thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us. And as always, stay safe out there.